I'll assume
yes,
so.
I can, Lucy.
Perfect. So before we start, just to let you know, my name's Lucy Smith. I'm one of the Overview and Scrutiny Officers here at Thurrock. I'm going to be leading the session today. I've also on the call. Oh, could you just mute your mic? Sorry, councillors. Sorry. Let me. There we go. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, so I'm Lucy Smith. I'm one of the Overview and Scrutiny Officers here at Thurrock. And I'm going to be leading the session today. On the call, we've also got Claire Dixon, Emma Trencher, and Matt Bolter, who also work in Overview and Scrutiny. Matt's the head of Democratic Services as well. If at any point during the session you've got any questions, then please feel free to raise your hand, shout out. Claire's going to be keeping an eye on the chat and on raised hands, so we should be on top of it. And like I say, the session will be recorded, so any problems, then please let me know. So the session today is getting the best out of a committee pre-brief. It might seem quite basic, but actually a committee pre-brief is one of the most important meetings that you can attend at Thurrock, particularly to get the best out of a committee meeting. So we think it's really important just to go over today how they work at Thurrock, how they work in general, and then take any questions. The session will be about half an hour today, so hopefully we'll do a presentation for about 20 minutes and then time for questions at the end. If I run over, just let me know. So next slide. There we go. So the outcomes of the session today. So ultimately, like I say, this session will improve committee pre-briefs and should improve committee meetings at Thurrock. So really what we'll try and do today is understand their purpose, how they work at Thurrock, and how we can utilise pre-meets effectively, hopefully leading to better questioning, stronger evidence-based scrutiny and other committee meetings, also leading to clearer member officer collaboration and more focused, efficient and effective committee meetings. So I'd like to start just with a quote. So this is from the Local Government Association Councillors Workbook on Scrutiny. Although all committees, or some committees at Thurrock have committee pre-briefs, they are utilised mainly for overview and scrutiny. There are other committees, planning, audit, cabinet, for example, where you might also be invited to attend a committee pre-brief. But this is the quote from the LGA. So for scrutiny to be effective, it needs to act and be seen as a critical friend, identifying where decisions could be improved and how to prevent mistakes being made or repeated. So this really happens in the committee meeting itself, identifying where decisions could be improved and how to prevent mistakes. But there are also other forums for that, for example, at pre-meets. So if you have a pre-meet, during that discussion with the report authors or with the wider committee, you can identify, decisions that, need to be improved, or areas where you're not quite sure of the recommendations, you're not quite happy with, some of the wording, some of the data. So although committee meetings are important, it is equally important to, attend and engage with the pre-briefs when they're offered. So moving on, I've got 4 questions on the screen. What is a pre-brief? Why is it different from a formal committee meeting or political group briefing? Why do pre-briefs matter? And what would a poor committee meeting look like when no pre-brief had been held? I'm not sure if anyone wants to stick their hand up and potentially give an answer as to any of the 4 questions, really. No, if not, I can crack on. So really, what is a pre-brief? And this sounds, quite, they are quite self-explanatory. And I don't want to sit here and, teach you to suck eggs. But it's a meeting that's held before the formal committee meeting, really to clarify any technical questions you might have, any knowledge-based questions. For example, what does this acronym mean? Where does this data come from? What does this number mean? And it's also useful to discuss, the key lines of inquiry that you might have before a meeting, and discuss who will ask which questions. So that's not to say, and it's really not the case at Thurrock, but, the committees aren't scripted, they're not rehearsed, but the pre-brief gives you a chance to be able to identify what questions you might want to ask, what questions that colleagues might want to ask, and to be able to have those discussions in an informal environment. So, for example, you might have a report at place overview and scrutiny around housing. One of the committee members might have had 40 years of experience, as a housing officer at a local authority. So they might have some different questions that you might have. And the pre-brief is a chance to say, right, well, you can ask these questions, and then someone else might have experience regarding looked after children. So, they might ask the questions around that. And having that pre-brief is the chance to be able to have those discussions. So why is it different from a formal committee meeting or political group briefing? Again, quite self-explanatory, but the formal committee briefing is live streamed, it's recorded, and it's open to the public. In comparison, the pre-brief is the closed, informal session beforehand with officers and report authors. Like I say, not recorded, not open to the public. At overview and scrutiny, for example, the pre-briefs won't include, or most often might not include, the cabinet members, because they'll attend the formal committee meeting. In comparison, the political group briefing only involves obviously one political group, whereas the formal committee meeting and the pre-brief involve all committee members and co-opted members, regardless of political party. So now the big one, why do pre-briefs matter? That was kind of the introductory, section. Pre-briefs are important because I think it helps members to clarify some of the complex issues that might arise during the committee meeting, and to be able to do so in an informal, closed forum. So you can ask those questions, some of the technical questions, and really get to grips with the subject matter without having to do so, like I say, in front of members of the public. You can identify your key lines of inquiries, the questions that you might have. And it's also a chance for committee members, regardless of what committee you're sitting on, to understand the recommendations and some of the risks involved in the decisions that you might be asked to make. So, for example, for cabinet, you might be asked to make a decision regarding something quite, controversial, something quite large. So having the pre-briefs is the chance to be able to discuss the recommendations. Do we actually want to do X, Y, Z? The rationale behind it, any kind of issues that might come out of that. And it also gives you the opportunity as well to discuss any potential alternative recommendations that you might have. And I think this is quite important in a scrutiny context. So, sorry. So really what it means is, you could look at a report and you could say, actually, I don't necessarily agree with recommendation 1. So as part of the pre-brief, you might have that discussion and you might have that conversation with your other committee members saying, do you agree with recommendation 1? I don't necessarily agree. And you could have that in an informal setting, really. So, for example, if you have a report going to place, and you might be asked to recommend to cabinet to, sell off, I don't know, 10 council houses, for example. If you don't agree with that, your chance to have that discussion outside of the public forum will be at your committee pre-brief, where you can discuss with the wider committee, and then come up with any alternative recommendations that you might want to present, you might want to discuss during the committee meeting itself. And then in comparison, what would a poor committee meeting look like if you didn't have a pre-brief? And I think it's good to look at, positive and negative examples. So, from an officer perspective, if you had a poor committee meeting, you'd have quite a lot of repetition. You wouldn't necessarily discuss some of the key points, some of the key risks, the key recommendations, going off on a tangent sometimes. If you have a committee meeting that's officer-led rather than member-led, if you don't have a pre-meeting, you don't have that chance to be able to have those discussions, which might be necessary before the committee meeting. And also rubber stamping of reports and not having any kind of proper scrutiny or discussion. So that's really the role of the pre-brief. And I know it is, they might be quite self-explanatory, but we just really want to highlight that, they are important meetings to attend. And particularly for things like overview and scrutiny, it gives you that chance to meet with report authors and, build that relationship that you might not otherwise have, and ask them questions that, you might not necessarily want to do in the public meeting. Although obviously if you do ask a question in the pre-brief and then actually think, no, this needs to come before the public, you always have that opportunity. So the opportunity is always there. It's just, gives you that kind of that pre-discussion before the formal committee. So moving on, committee pre-briefs at Thurrock. So looking at specifically at Thurrock, so this isn't always the case, but most of the time you have committee pre-briefs that are often held the evening before, the evening of the formal committee meeting. So if your formal committee meeting starts at 7, then you often have the pre-meet start at 6 or 6:30, giving you kind of 45 minutes, 20 minutes to be able to have that discussion. It also gives you the opportunity, as I say, to ask any knowledge-based questions, any kind of, meaning of certain terms prior to start of the formal meeting. So you leave the formal meeting for the strategic wider discussion. Like it says here, chairs may be able to group questions into themes, topics, and reduce duplication and streamline the approach. So, if, for example, you have someone that's really knowledgeable, like I say, about housing, then you can discuss that thematically and they can, lead on the questioning. Sometimes it just helps to make the committee meeting more efficient. Particularly, I think, for meetings where you're guillotined. So, for example, over in scrutiny, you've got 2.5 hour time limit. So making the most of that 2.5 hours is of top importance, really. Because you want to be able to, ask those strategic questions without, without, like I say, going off into tangents. Really just to utilize the committee meeting effectively. Moving on, so preparing for pre-briefs. Again, some of this is quite basic, but we just want to reiterate and highlight the importance of preparing for the pre-briefs. So, for example, coming to the meeting prepared, having read the agendas and the papers, so you know what questions you have to ask, what decisions you need to make, all of those kind of things. And then also, if you do have questions, so you read the report and actually you think, I need more clarification on this, I need more detail, you can always ask, the relevant overview and scrutiny officer or the report author, and we'll always get the questions for you. Because really, what we don't want to happen is you go into the meeting itself, you ask some of the questions and the officers don't know the answer, because at that point the momentum you lose that momentum. Obviously, any questions that you ask during the committee meetings or during the pre-briefs that can't be answered, we log those as part of the action log and we monitor, we follow up, and we provide those to you outside of the meeting. But it's always best during the committee pre-brief to ask any of those questions where you need that further clarification. We also recommend that you identify the gaps in the evidence or the recommendations within the report. So, for example, if you're looking at a data set and you notice that, you're looking at an NHS report and the NHS data only contains the data for age, 30 to 40, and you might think, well, why does it not contain older or younger or whatever? And the time to ask that might be at the pre-brief, because there might be quite a simple answer for it that the report author can say, or it might actually be something that needs further investigation and further investigation, really. So then you can ask that at the public committee meeting, and you can get those clarifications in the formal setting. We'd also recommend preparing your key lines of inquiry, so thinking about why they're important and what additional information you want to know, so that you can make your decision. Because sometimes you might read a report and you might think, actually, I need XYZ information. So if you come to the pre-brief and say to the report author, I need XYZ, they'll be able to provide that to you before the committee meeting. So then you have all the information that you need to be able to make the decisions that you're being asked to make, particularly if you have you sit on cabinet or audit committee, standards committee, any of those kinds of committees where there's decisions that are required. So really then this leads us on to asking questions at committee pre-briefs. And again, this is the same for committee meetings, really, but the same rules apply. We just want to reiterate it here. So when you go to the committee pre-briefs, we recommend, open questions so you can have those expanded answers, who, how, what, why, rather than just the closed yes, no questions. Again, it's always better to use evidence-based challenge rather than anecdotal. So, if you read a report and you say, actually, this is the data from 2018, but I know there's data from 2025, you can present that to the report author and say, well, why was this data not used? Being able to find those gaps and find the additional information that you need rather than just the anecdote of, oh, Mrs. Blogs at number 2, for example. And that leads you on then to, the probing the assumptions. So always asking why. So you might read the report and it might say, oh, there are no financial implications. We can probe that assumption at the committee pre-brief. Why are there no financial implications? Should there be financial implications? And you might, like I say, you might get a, really satisfactory answer from the officer, and then, that's kind of that resolved. Whereas actually you might think, no, this needs more. At the public meeting, you can then raise it and say, why are there no financial implications? And you can have that conversation. Finally, that leads us on to testing the outcomes and the impact. So what impact will this have on residents? Is the outcome, of the report what you think it will be? And then you can have those conversations at pre-briefs. So for example, what evidence supports X? How will success be measured? And what are the risks associated with this decision? So like I say, this covers both the pre-briefs and the meetings really. But I think it's just highlighting that, the pre-briefs are really important for members and for officers as well, because it also gives officers the chance to maybe ask you some questions or get your thoughts. And like I say, build that relationship, and really get into the nitty-gritty of the reports in an informal environment without, having the cameras and the live stream and all the members of the public. Which is why having these pre-briefs is so important. And we'd really recommend that if you if you get invited to attend and engage as much as you can. Obviously we know that there are a lot of meetings for councillors, so it's a very busy time. But yeah, very finally, all the training materials, so what I've spoken about today, this presentation, the link to the workbook, they can all be found on the Councillor Hub, and you should have the QR code, which is on screen now. Like I say, this session's been recorded, so again, if you want to watch it back, you can find that on the Councillor Hub. And I think that's everything from me. I know it's been a lot of 15-20 minutes of me just talking at you, so I'm happy if anyone's got any questions, and please feel free. I'll stop sharing my screen. Matt?
Thank you, Lucy. I'd just jump in just in case members didn't have any questions. I thought I'd just make some summary comments. I think what's also really key to add is that when the council was first placed into intervention in 2022, 2023, and we had a best value inspection, one of the key strands of improvement that came out was the ability for elected members to ask good questions. And that is a real shortcut to being an incredibly effective committee member, is getting into a committee and asking the right questions so that you can make clear decisions within the 2 hours that you're in that meeting. So the pre-brief is a real important, as Lucy said many times, very important, but it's also your safe space. So if you are a chair of a committee, that is your opportunity to understand your other fellow members on your committee, where they sit, the levels of their understanding, their political viewpoints, their personal viewpoints, and it allows you as a chair to manage that meeting when it starts at 7 o'clock, because you've already known kind of the sense within the room. And if you're not the chair, it's your ability on your opportunity rather to test your knowledge, to build your background understanding of some of the reports, so that when you start at 7 o'clock, you can maybe potentially cut out some of the questions that you could have in the pre-briefing to gain your understanding, so that when you're going live with the actual public committee, you're asking the key questions that get to the nub of the issue. And I think That's why pre-briefs are so important, because they allow you that opportunity to have the honest conversations with officers before you go into the public session, to make sure you understand what is being asked of you and that you are clear on those decisions you make. And that's all I was going to say. Thank you, Lucy.
Thanks, Matt. Any questions? Or I don't see any hands raised. So if everyone's happy, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know it's a very warm evening, so thank you so much for sitting here and listening for 20 minutes. If you've got any questions afterwards, please feel free to drop me an email. You know, myself, Claire, Emma, Matt, we're always around. But yeah, get 10 minutes back of your evening. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a lovely evening and take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy.